So I was told we have to start exactly on time, no matter how many people are in the room. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm really happy that everybody is here joining me for the last presentation of the day. I didn't know if I'd be presenting to nobody or maybe one or two people, so this is pretty exciting. I'm also excited to be at a conference. I've done like no conferences for 2.5 years, and now 2 weeks, 2 conferences. I could get used to this. So I'm here to talk about malware, and I started, I guess, with my kind of stupid, provocative question, where does malware come from? I picked that title because everybody probably has a duh response to that, right? Like, it's obviously email, right? It all comes from social media or whatever you've seen a lot of. And so what we were doing for this presentation is we looked at all of the malware that we've blocked so far this year. So that's about 1.2 million malware blocks. This is from January 1st through the end of May, so almost half of a year worth of malware blocks. We have at Netscope about 3.1 million users that were in this data set, meaning like on average workday we'll see 3.1 million people where these malware downloads were generated from. It's mostly managed enterprise Windows laptops, so it's not a lot of phones, so keep that in mind as we go through, like, hey Ray, why didn't you see more Android malware? Well, because I'm not looking at a lot of phones, I'm still looking at laptops. And it's all coming from our secure web gateway. So it's all HTTP, HTTPS traffic. So just another thing to keep in mind as you're saying, hey, that doesn't maybe jive with what I see in my organization. So this is my lawyer slide. So I am presenting stuff that we've extracted from our data in our telemetry. This is based on anonymized data that we collect from a subset of our customers that give us prior authorization to do this kind of research. And another thing I just want to make super clear, and I'll bring this up again just to make sure it clicks, is when I talk about something and I talk about like, oh, OneDrive is where I'm seeing the most malware downloads, all I see is the downloads. In other words, attacker puts malware all over the internet, victims visiting some websites. I'm talking here just about that big red highlighted thing. I'm talking about the places where attackers were successful in getting a victim to try to download some malware, where we were able to step in and say, whoa, 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 don't do that. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we go. So I'm going to focus this in 2 places. Most of the time I'm going to spend talking about some of the really cool stuff that we've seen attackers doing so far this year to get people to try to click on and download malware. That's most of it, but this lends itself toward the let's talk strategy for then defending against that bent. And so, again, let's just talk about those 1+ million malware downloads. Let's start looking at them by file type. Again, it's mostly Windows laptops. So no surprise, the most popular file types that we're seeing are EXE and DLL files, right? PE files for Windows. That makes sense. Office files make sense. If I was giving this presentation 2.5 years ago, that little slice of that pie that's Office files would have been like half of that pie, because at that time, Emotet was super active. We saw just some really crazy, persistent email campaigns distributing malicious Office documents. That's come down an awful lot, and I can thank Google and I can thank Microsoft a lot for that. Google started saying, please don't download this Office document. It has something in there that might not be something you want to run on your computer. Then eventually Microsoft started blocking macros by default. Finally, we threw a party for it, right? Sure, it's based on Mark of the Web, and Mark of the Web is only relevant on Windows systems, and there's ways to get around that, right? But that was a huge win, and so we're excited about that. And then that little slice of other, there's some cool stuff in there, right? There's Chrome extensions, there's different archive formats, PowerShell scripts are, of course, getting more and more popular, link files. So there's cool stuff in there. It's just the cool stuff isn't the majority, right? The majority is just, hey, here's another Trojan downloader. When it comes to file types, again, right, this is mostly people downloading stuff from the web, so we're mostly blocking that initial stage. So lots of Trojans, lots of downloaders. You might look at this chart and tell me you're a little bit crazy because phishing isn't malware and exploits aren't malware. I'll get to the phishing because the phishing is weird. We call it phishing because when we first saw this happening, it was all related to phishing, and now we've seen it really spread out from there, so we'll dive into that. And when I say exploit here, I'm talking about file-based exploits, right? So this is somebody actually trying to download malware that's a file-based exploit, exploiting something on their local machine. And then that others, that's everything else, ransomware, all the really scary stuff, next stage downloads, other types of malware. In terms of families, this is something people that say, well, what's the family that is 90% of all the malware downloads you see? There's really no dominant family. In fact, you look at these and you might say, I'm going to have to Google that. I've never even heard of that before, except for maybe Emotet that just will not go away no matter how many times we declare victory over Emotet. So in other words, just lots of different stuff, right? There's no dominant family. Malware is so fragmented now. Everybody's stealing code from each other, building new things. We keep giving them new family names. So there's just nothing ever that really stands out. So now let's pivot to, I think, what is the cool stuff. And I ordered this in what I think is most cool to least cool. So I'm going to lead with the coolest thing I think we've seen in the past year, which is attackers just getting really good at marketing, really good at SEO, and finding really clever ways to use PDFs. And so what we saw that had us focusing on this is we're looking at all these malware downloads, and we're looking at all the referrers and those HTTP headers for those malware downloads. And we start thinking, hey, something's weird. We must have something that's broken and giving us bad data, because Google, www.google.com, can't possibly be the referrer for 15% of all the malware downloads that we're seeing. And then we started looking and we're like, oh, Bing's in there, Baidu's there, oh, DuckDuckGo's even in there, right? All of the search engines. And we start looking, and it's not just one URL, right? It's thousands of URLs across those search engines. And it's victims all over the place, right? It wasn't the case of like, oh, there's like somebody doing something weird somewhere who's finding these PDFs and trying to download them. No, this was like all over the board, different industries, different geographies, different languages, people managing to find themselves downloading malicious PDFs directly from referrals from Google. Then when we looked at where those PDFs were located, also no rhyme or reason to it. They were all over the web. So some of the top places they were Weebly, Baidu Cloud, Squarespace, S3, a bunch of different CDNs. There wasn't like one favorite CDN here. And then a boatload, as you could probably expect, WordPress websites that were obviously left open or compromised in some way. And so also not much sense to make out of it there. So then we start looking at the files themselves to try to see what's going on there. And we look at one, and it looks like this. It's a stupid CAPTCHA on the first page, and we say, we've seen this before, right? Let's see what the other one is. The next one's another stupid CAPTCHA. Next one's another stupid CAPTCHA. We've probably hand-looked through 100 of these at this point and found nothing but PDFs that look exactly like this, but are all subtly different. So page one, huge blank page, CAPTCHA. The CAPTCHA is a link. You click anywhere on it, it's sending you to a URL that usually looks innocuous. We found a lot of feed burner URLs there, different RSS feed URLs there. Clearly a technique where you can point somebody to something, and that thing that they're going to grab is going to be the latest thing on a feed. So you can keep changing what that payload is that they're getting there, and you're also hitting a domain that's probably not going to be URL filtered. You click on one of those, you end up going through just a boatload of redirects. And at the end of it, all over the place. I mentioned that I said this slice of the pie was phishing malware. So when we first saw these, they were all leading to phishing pages. And now we're seeing more and more of them, and they're leading to malware download pages and scam pages and spam and click fraud and some really graphic pornography I wish I could unsee. But that's like... And they're also unrelated to a theme. So like each one of these PDFs has a theme to it. And then you click on the link and you go somewhere, and there seems to be like no rhyme or reason to the theme of the PDF and the end. And so the rest of the PDF, every one of these has a title. And the title is usually something very specific. I picked one of the generic ones here that we saw a few times. But the most common one that we saw was user manual. And so it's always like something that none of us had ever heard of, user manual. It was like medical equipment, very specific components of car engines, industrial automation equipment, a lot of different multimeters and their like specific product names, some standards documents, some tax forms. But it seems like the idea here is pick something so specific that if you can manage to get the search engines to index it, it's probably going to be in that first page of search results. And so somebody's probably going to see it and click on it. The second page of that, after that title, is just like a bunch of text that they clearly just copied and pasted, usually out of those user manuals. So it said user manual for this, then that entire user manual is at approximately that font size inside that PDF, usually crammed into a page or two. And then at the end, they know their SEO. You need links. So the ends of these PDFs are usually links to a bunch of other PDFs exactly like this. So they've got a system set up where when they generate new ones, they make sure they backlink to the old ones that they've already got set up. So just super weird. And so what are we doing about this, right? Because we first saw this years ago, right? And what do? You report them to everybody you can. You report them to Microsoft, to Google, get them delisted from the search engines. You also, if they're hosted somewhere where you have a hosting provider you can get in contact with, you contact the hosting provider, and that gets taken down. So we've been doing this forever. And then it was around November, this started happening, meaning this is like 4.5x what we were seeing this time last year. It's just crazy how fast this is going. And so we continue to report. They continue to get taken down. Usually Microsoft and Google are very fast, and you go and you Google those terms, and you won't find that anywhere. The hosting providers are usually a little slower, but I'm not as worried about the hosting providers if the main way to drive traffic there is now gone. And so the question is it working? And I'd say I'm playing a really stupid game of whack-a-mole. We are really good at taking down, or helping to take down, because we can't do anything but report, the URLs that we know about. But there's just new ones constantly, right? It's always new search terms. It's always something else. And so this is just something interesting, right? Because again, we think about how people end up clicking on malware, and you're like, oh, it's obviously email. And this is not email, right? This is just something that everybody does in their everyday life. Google something they need, and then click on the result that seems like it's going to give it to them. And then, oh, another CAPTCHA. I click on those all the time, right? Of course, I'm going to click on the CAPTCHA. I'll click on all the buses and the fire hydrants, and then I'll get my manual. So it's just like another way that what attackers are doing is really good marketing in the way that everybody else is doing marketing. And it's becoming increasingly hard to train people, regular people, not security professionals, right? Everybody else, to just be able to recognize this, right? You should know every time you see a search result in Google that that's a bad search result you shouldn't click on versus a good search result you should click on. Not super easy, especially when things keep changing so much. So that was attack strategy number 1. I think I have a total of 4 of these. So number 2, I'm calling meet people in the cloud. And so when we look at all these malware downloads and where the actual malware download was hosted, it's been hovering around for the past few years, 50% of them sitting on cloud apps versus the infected WordPress pages and all over the normal web. And we always look at that list of the top apps. And this goes back to make sure I'm super clear about what I'm saying. When you look at that list of top apps, you're like, OMG, that's Microsoft and Google and Box and Dropbox. I can't believe that they are doing such a bad job. That's not what's happening here. They're doing an excellent job. They're trying to keep up with this as well. they are just so incredibly popular that if an attacker manages to get malware hosted on OneDrive for a significant amount of time and manages to get people to click on links to visit that malware, there's probably not a lot in terms of things they were trained to avoid that's going to help them. Oh, OneDrive link? Cool. I click on OneDrive links 1,000 times a day. Obviously, I'm going to click on this OneDrive link too. It seems super important. And from a URL filtering or DNS filtering point of view, right, if you're filtering at that level, also not going to do anything about OneDrive, right, unless you decided you're going to block OneDrive. And so you see, GitHub, Box, Dropbox, Salesforce, all sorts of things there, and it's just like a list of popular apps. So, the ordering changes depending on who's doing what. I mentioned Emotet. Emotet a few years ago picked Box as their favorite cloud app to abuse, and Box was up top of this list for months. It's just the way it is, right? It's trends of what attackers are doing and what users are falling for. So just like to carve that up, obviously the cloud storage apps are a big part of this because it's easy to throw anything on free cloud storage accounts. Software hosting websites, I think I have an example here of something that we recently saw on GitHub, but we see tons of stuff on GitHub and SourceForge again. Because you can throw anything you want on GitHub and SourceForge. File transfer, ZippyShare and WeTransfer are the biggest ones we see in that regard. And then chat, you'd probably think like social media would be higher up here. We actually see more through chat, especially through like Discord, than we've seen recently through social media. So those seem to be like the favorite ways that attackers are trying to reach users through non-traditional means outside of email. So my example here, this was one, Gustavo on my team just found this, I think, a month or two ago. It's Redline Steeler. Redline Steeler is not super new. I think it's been around at least a year and a half. It does exactly what its name says it does. It steals, typically save data in the browsers, chat logs from Discord and Telegram, any sort of VPN or FTP credentials it can find on the end host. And the way we saw somebody distributing Redline Steeler was just like purely let's hit people where they're probably seeking out information, not sort of go after them with email. So I actually spun up a YouTube channel and talked about something that they figured everybody would get excited about, cryptocurrency, right? Crypto YouTube channel. And all those videos and the person's profile, everything was linking to a Chrome extension you should download from GitHub. That wasn't a Chrome extension at all. It was actually just Redline Steeler. And so we found this because somebody fell for this. We saw the refers, we saw it came from YouTube, and we helped get this taken down both by YouTube and GitHub. So next strategy here is, the same way you're sort of going to cloud apps, because those are the cloud apps that everybody's using, so they're probably going to fall for and click on and allow those attacks to happen. Also make sure that when you're going somewhere on the web, that place you go on the web is also somewhere a user is likely to click. And so, like I said, it's about 50-50 split of the malware coming from web or cloud. And the breakdown here, you look at this and your initial reaction is probably like, well, hell yeah, I'm blocking some of that stuff because it's super easy. Because why in the world would I allow people to download from shareware and freeware sites? Let's just block all those. And those uncategorized sites, let's just block all of that too. And we're winning now because we're blocking 25% of all the malware downloads that we've recently seen, right? And so that's kind of the point here, is like the conventional wisdom of like block the bad stuff kind of drove attackers to make sure they weren't going to the bad places, need to make sure they go to the more legitimate places where it's going to be harder for you to filter them away. And so content servers are the biggest block here, right, about 1/5 of it. That's CDNs, all kinds of different CDNs. That's just how the web works, right? And so the web works that way for normal people doing benign things. The web works that way for attackers doing malicious things. Get the malware on those CDNs, it's going to be a little harder to filter out. The business and technology sites, two very distinct trends that we're seeing there. One is find a business or technology-oriented WordPress site and link to your malware from it, right? Because odds are they didn't patch, right? There's a way for us to abuse that. The other one, which is a little easier for an attacker to do, is just spin up a new website, copy some existing website that has a lot of content, host it there for a while so that WebRoot and all the URL classifying services on the web find it and classify it and say, oh, yep, this is a technology site. Then start abusing things, right? So we've seen lots of just like mirrors of Yahoo's landing page, mirrors of AOL's landing page, mirrors of blogs, mirrors of anything you can think of. Run your web crawler, scrape that site, spin it up on your own web server, wait till it's classified as normal traffic, then launch your attack. And so this is just another way that, sure, you still have to drive people to that site, but you're at least kind of confident that simple URL filters aren't going to filter that stuff out. And so the last one, because I led with, of course, the answer is email. The last one I just wanted to share was get a little bit more creative than you used to be with email. And especially because you know everybody in the whole world in the enterprise is using Google Workspaces or OneDrive. So a really nice way to meet them there and generate some really nice emails is just start uploading bad stuff to OneDrive and Google Drive and start commenting on it, which obviously you do automated through API. And target whoever you want, right? At however many people Google will allow you to in every comment, and try to drive people to those documents. And so this is just one example of a pretty low effort one. You know, this was just like a fake shipping invoice. I don't think anybody actually fell for this one, but we see a lot of these that are more targeted, more sophisticated, that look like they're coming from somebody that you work with, because it's easy to set your name to whatever you want your name to be when you create a OneDrive or a Google Drive account. And that's that, right? I've seen a bunch of these coming from my CEO. I've seen a bunch of these coming from other companies' CEOs to their employees. And it's just, you know, another way that you might catch somebody off guard. Because I probably have 100 emails per day of somebody tagged you in a document. And so you just get used to either clicking to go to those documents or clicking on whatever the thing is somebody's trying to push you to in one of those documents. And your email filters aren't filtering this kind of stuff out either. So that brings me to defensive strategies that maybe we can put in place to do something about this. And so, you know, the first lesson that I take from this is that if you're doing URL filtering at the category or domain level, it's just really not effective against the majority of the stuff we see users getting to today. The tax shifting to the cloud apps have made you know, that a lot harder. Once upon a time, we used to joke, how long until this URL feed that we subscribe to sends us drive.google.com again as one of those malicious domains we need to block on account of how much malware they saw at drive.google.com. The second one here is that attackers are most successful when they're trying to catch their victims off guard. So sure, we still see a lot of just stupid email-driven, click on this link and they'll get to a bad thing type stuff. But it's getting more creative. Those search engine results, I mean, who's taken a security training here where you were warned to be wary of search engine results? Anybody? I've never seen one, right? But this has been happening for at least 2.5 years that I'm aware of. Right, but no security training for that, because what are you going to tell people? The other challenge, right, with security training and cloud apps and that kind of stuff, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about malware, but I'll digress a little bit. A lot of the phishing pages we see today are hosted on whatever app they're phishing for, right? So we see a lot of Office 365 phishing pages hosted on Azure websites. And when all you've trained your users to do is just be suspicious of things when there's no green lock next to the URL, Or when you click on that green lock, the certificate's issued to GoDaddy or Let's Encrypt. Or maybe when you look at the URL, you're like, that's a weird URL. But when these kinds of phishing pages get spun up, that certificate is issued by Microsoft to Windows.net, which is owned by Microsoft. And it's got a really pretty green lock there. And so it's just becoming really hard, right? And so I don't want to sound like I'm too down on the trainings, right? But there's a limit to how effective trainings can really be and how much you can change users' behavior without turning them into somebody like us who is paranoid of everything, trusts nobody, never clicks on anything ever except in their special machine that they use to click on things, right? And that's not what we're trying to do to the world, right? Because we'd probably all lose our jobs if we went back and said, yep, we have to block search engines, emails, and most cloud apps to solve the malware problem. Right, that's not what we're advocating for. Sorry, that was my digression. So creative email work, search engines work, these cloud apps work, and we need to make sure we're doing something to address those. So sort of like my call to action is please, please, please double check your security controls. I know you steer all your traffic through your network security controls, because obviously you do, right? Except for that traffic you don't steer, right? That traffic you weren't thinking about that when you said we steer everything. And I know there's a lot of vendors out there that say, well, don't steer our traffic through your security controls. It's too much traffic, and nothing bad will ever come through our network, right? And so that's not what we're seeing, right? We are seeing bad things make it to their victims through those networks. Also, when you're checking those controls, make sure you're not like entirely dependent on domain-based blocking and category-based blocking. It'll be effective. You will block a lot of stuff. And if your goal is to come up with some awesome charts to show your board of how much stuff you blocked, it'll be big numbers, right? Because there's still a lot of malicious stuff on the uncategorized websites and on the .xyz and .ru and all sorts of weird TLDs that are easy to block. It's just not everything. And the stuff that's making it through is obviously the stuff that's not on those TLDs and not on those domains. So the other thing that I couldn't resist, I really just wanted to talk about where malware comes from, but I couldn't resist also talking about what weird stuff we see malware doing after it lands on somebody's machine. And so this is kind of like the what's next. This is we're seeing some of this, and it's starting to make us nervous that attackers might have realized how successful this is and start doing more of it. And that's the getting creative with your command and control. And so traditional command and control is like what's going on the top of this slide, right? You have an attacker who obviously that's an attacker because they're using green text on a black background. That's for me. I know that everybody uses like the person in a hoodie. I like the green text, right? That's only hackers. I loved The Matrix growing up. And they spin up their own server. And they use that server for whatever, right? It's a one-way communication, a dead drop resolver, maybe it's two-way communication. But the fact that it's an attacker-controlled server, and it's been that way for a long time, means that we've gotten pretty good at detecting and protecting against that stuff, right? We have DGA detection algorithms where we can identify DGA domains and block them proactively. A lot of those top-level domains, you can just block them. You can get tons of suricata rules that you can put into place that's going to block a lot of what we see for command and control. And you can have a really good defense against command and control there. Sure, you're still worried about malleable C2 and Cobalt Strike, right? Like that's one where maybe we haven't fully gotten a hand around staying ahead of what's going on with Cobalt Strike in the wild, but it's pretty good, right? We feel like we've got a good strategy there. And what we've seen start happening is that those attackers have figured out that infrastructure is hard, that cloud apps are cheap, that nobody blocks them, and that it's super easy to use. And so all of that stuff we've seen just start happening over cloud apps. We've seen dead drop resolvers in the form of YouTube comments in the form of just files uploaded to random S3 buckets all over the internet, comments added to emails, all sorts of weird things, right? If you find an app where you can post something publicly or send a message, it's a really nice app to use for command and control. And so to sort of illustrate that this isn't like some crazy thing that Ray's talking about that's not really happening, I collected just a few examples of different attackers and campaigns we've seen just in the past few months and what cloud apps they were using. And so you see, again, like what's the theme? I don't know what the theme is. The theme is they seem to be just picking their favorite cloud apps, the ones they're most familiar with, because they just know how to do it. The other thing that helps is that a lot of people have written toolkits to do this, and they've posted them to GitHub. So there's C3, there's Slackor, there's Twitor. There's a bunch of these. If you go to GitHub and just look for like cloud command and control tools, there's a bunch of these tools that you can just download, and they're really useful for people like us because it's fun to run them in our environment and say, hey, if somebody started using Twitter as a command and control channel, would anybody notice, right? Would any of our security controls say, it's really weird that Ray started tweeting base 64 encoded strings every 10 minutes, and he does it 24/7 now. And so, so what I'm trying to indicate there is like, there are ways to detect this kind of stuff. It's just that maybe the tools we've already set up aren't good at detecting this, right? It's not easy to write a suricata rule that detects Twitter posts from Ray without completely breaking Twitter. So that's sort of the takeaway there on the command and control side. And so that was about it. I left a healthy blanket of time for questions. So if you have any questions, I'm here to entertain them. If nobody has questions, I do have like some survey questions. I love asking questions like this. So when you saw the title to this presentation, whose reaction was like email or like something just like guttural where you were like, I know the answer to this because I deal with this all the time? So, okay, there's a few of them. Is there anything that, like, I talked about here that you're seeing in your environments? Or, like, did you learn something new, like something here I talked about that you haven't seen yet? In the last couple, so that comment was, we've had a couple Google Drive phishing emails in the last couple hours. That sounds about right. And you said a couple hundred, or literally just like two? A couple unique, yeah. So right. The Google Drive phishing email thing is really interesting too, because I mean, like, it's a phishing email. I don't know if what you saw was like, a comment or a Google Drive file or something related to phishing. But one of the things we started to see more and more is like a fake Google Drive plugin. And so it's a please authorize access to Google Drive to this seemingly innocuous and useful app. And that's kind of like the newest version of phishing we've seen. And so we've seen it it's mostly been Google Drive and Microsoft 365. And the flavor is usually like, here's a fake plugin, please authorize it, and all it needs is permissions to read your email and send email on your behalf, and typically to view all of your documents either in Google Drive or Microsoft 365. And it's really hard, right? Because like if it's a credential phishing email for Google Drive or OneDrive, you have MFA, of course, right? You have MFA, right? So what good is it if the attacker gets the email or gets the username and password for the email? But if they authorize that plugin, they're already authenticated. They already did the MFA step up, and all they're doing is clicking and saying allow. And that's, I mean, it's just a lot harder to prevent. You can go in and disable that feature, which is not a bad idea if you don't think your users should be allowing whatever they feel like they should allow. You can also monitor it, right? There's logs of that stuff. You can go in and see the stuff that everybody's authorized. The first time we looked to see what people had authorized, it just in our company internally, I think somebody almost fainted in the meeting because we thought, oh, it's pretty bad. I bet you people have authorized like 2 or 3 things each. And there'd be like somebody who had authorized like 97 different apps. And the sets of permissions they were like email, 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 manage your documents, email, manage your documents, full control over everything. And it's just a crazy ecosystem to allow your users to do that. Get some bang from the buck. So the question was like, where do you get some bang from the buck if you want to do some threat hunting on this? So like assuming you have some data to threat hunt in, right? I'd say start looking at those malware alerts and where they're coming from. So like the alerts you're actually getting in your environment. Take a look at those and see like how people are getting there, you know, like why they're clicking on this stuff, and start with whatever's happening to you. Right, I know that like it's exciting to come and see these presentations and for me to say like this is the kind of stuff we're seeing, right? But if you aren't seeing this stuff, then obviously the place to start isn't with the crazy stuff Ray talked about today. The place to start is with whatever you're seeing in your environment and what you can start locking down from there. So that's always my advice is start with whatever's happening to you. And make sure that you are thinking like whatever, like think a step ahead of it, right? Like this is what I see happening. What could I have maybe blocked upstream to prevent this from happening? Because that's typically what we're doing is we're finding those, you know, like it got to the point where somebody tried to download malware. I wish it didn't even get to that point. I wish we had blocked the page that they visited that they clicked on or blocked the email, right? Like you're trying to get ahead of it as much as possible. And then, I mean, the addendum to that is if you don't have visibility, visibility is always the first thing you want to do, right? You want to address that visibility gap. You want to make sure that you can see what's happening.
Question, on one of your earlier slides, you were showing like EXEs and then I think zip files, but the zip file, right? So are you pulling that from like what, like the actual file is delivered like in a fish? Or when it's extracted, does it line up with most EXEs are in zips and then PDFs?
So this chart is of just like that first thing that the user's clicking on, right? So when I say exe DLL here, I mean like the user, you know, is clicking on a link to download an exe or DLL. So this is
The zip file, like once it's
right. Yeah. So once, yeah. So the exactly. So yeah. So once you extract those zips or the RARs or the gzips, a lot of what we've been seeing is a lot of that same stuff, you know, inside there. There's a lot of, we see a lot of, especially like RAR and gzip files where you can set the mark of the web and have it persist when you unzip that file. It'll contain the Office document and the bitmap file that the Office document's going to extract the malware from to drop. So we see, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff where it contains the exe or a PowerShell script. The link files that we see, a lot of them typically come in within zips, right? It's like unzip this, then click on the link file, and that's where you end up from there. So this is very much like just that sort of first swipe of whatever people are clicking on. Yeah. But now I want to go unzip all of them and figure out what's, you know, that's a lot harder data analysis to do. So we're talking to Microsoft and Google about it. We're talking to the hosting providers that are abused the most for it. Right now, it seems like the solution is keep playing whack-a-mole and hope that we have invested so much time and energy into playing whack-a-mole that whoever is doing it isn't getting the ROI they need and they give up. Other than that, I mean, the other things you could do, right, is try to get some of this stuff into the browser, right? maybe Google or Microsoft can be more proactive about what types of PDFs they index. You know, if Google wanted to stop it today, right, they could stop indexing PDFs. So there's like draconian things they could do, but that would hurt then all the legitimate PDFs they've indexed. So unfortunately, we're just hoping that we can beat them, demoralize them before they demoralize us.
How much of that stuff you're using you think is programmatically or AI generated?
Oh,
It's just all
that PDF stuff, we are convinced that that PDF stuff is 100% automated, and that, you know, it's probably just one group doing it right now. It's too similar every time. It has the same weird artifacts in every single one of those PDFs, which we detect with the same signature every single time as well. So, I mean, that's the other thing that we can do about it, right, is maybe it doesn't matter so much because everybody's EDR and network controls and everything is blocking the vast majority of this, because it is really stupid easy to detect. We have one signature that blocked all of those. They're not creative, but I'd say in general, most of the attacks that we thwart are clearly automated. The answer to that question, whether it was about Twitter or any other vendor, is usually yes, right? No vendor, I don't like using absolutes. Most vendors who create these apps aren't okay with people abusing them, right? They don't want people abusing them. And so they want to thwart abuse on those platforms. It's hard to do at the scale at which a lot of these operate, right? So like one of the questions I often get, it's funny that you picked Twitter, because I don't know a lot about what Twitter does to stop this stuff. But one question I often get is, Ray, you must be wrong, or maybe you're misrepresenting something, because I use Google Drive, and I use OneDrive, and I know that if I upload malware to Google Drive and OneDrive, it gets blocked. Right? Either I get a notification that malware was blocked, or when I try to download it, it says you can't download it's malware, or if I try to share it with somebody and they click on that shared link, it doesn't work. And so like a lot of these vendors even know that this stuff is happening, right? They know that people are gonna try to upload malware to these platforms. And so they're doing what they can to scan the files that were uploaded to those platforms. But these are companies operating at a very large scale, servicing people the world over with wildly different risk tolerances, and also don't want to be in the business of support, like a lot of us are, when some user complains that you blocked something that wasn't actually malicious, right? And so they're generally more conservative than we who work in corporate security are, because it has to be a one-size-fits-all solution, and they can't afford to go too far and damage the usability of that platform for the legitimate users, especially if that platform is a free platform that is completely dependent on the fact that it's super popular and they can serve people ads through it, which a lot of these platforms are. And so it's just, it's not malice on the part of any of these cloud providers. It's just a really hard problem to solve. And I mean, Twitter has a lot of other hard problems to solve around abuse of its platform. This probably isn't the most high profile of those problems right now.
What are you seeing from the CDN servers? What are people doing on that? I've always been really scared of that.
Yeah, I mean,
potentially like taking my cached website and then creating like a watering hole type attack. Has that happened yet?
So not so much. I think the majority of the CDN abuse that we see, and I think this is just, I feel like I kind of make the same statement in a lot of places. It's boring and it's simple, right? It's just that CDNs are generally ways for you to host files for your cheap. And so that's where they're hosting their files, right? And so again, I'm talking about malware, but when it's malicious websites, when it's malicious JavaScript, when, like whatever those malicious files are, it's just all over the CDNs. A lot of the early stuff you saw with CDN abuse, right, was around, I'm blanking on the term. Too late on a Friday, sorry. But there's an attack, right, where you can try to hit another website on the same CDN by crafting your requests in a certain way. Most CDNs check for that stuff now, right? So you don't see a lot. Domain fronting. There we go. My brain's not broken yet. Domain fronting. You don't see so much of that anymore because it's getting a lot harder because the CDNs enforce it. So that's like an example of like they saw the abuse, they were in a perfect position to do something about it. So they just now double check the SNI and the host header and make sure they make sense before they point you to whatever content you're at. So it's just boring, but there's a lot of it. So I promised I'd be on time, and I'm on time. Thanks so much for your attention.